Good morning. Hello, everyone. My name is Luciana Gama Muniz. I am a project director at the Brazilian Center for International Relations. Today, our event is a partnership with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. And I'm very pleased to welcome all of you. And I'm also very honored to be here today sharing this screen with this amazing group of women to discuss global alliances for sustainability on a 100% women female panel. So before we start our debate today, I would like to hand it over to Anja from Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and then to Ana Jaguaribe, who is CEBRI's member from our board of trustees. And Ana will give us some introduction about the discussion today. So first, please, Anja, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Luciana. My name is Anja Czymmeck. I am the head of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation here in Brazil. And I would like to welcome you on behalf of CAS and CEBRI to this seminar on global alliances for sustainability. It's a pleasure to be here, and especially to be together with all those ladies, amazing ladies here. I greet warmly all the participants, and today's event takes place against the background of this year's main topic of our CAS-CEBRI cooperation to research and to monitor the reorientation of multilateral politics, which focuses on the topics trade, digital economy, and sustainability. For the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Brazil and its activities in this country and all over the world, the topic of sustainability is a guideline. And as you might know, my country, Germany, has been proactive in developing ambitious environmental policies during the last decades, both nationally and internationally. And sustainable development is a guiding principle for the policies of the federal German government. So sustainability aims to achieve intergenerational equity, social cohesion, quality of life, and recognition of an international responsibility. And that's why it is so important to have a dialogue on this topic on a multilateral and international level. Germany has adopted a sustainable development strategy already in 2002, and this strategy has been updated several times since then, last time in 2018. And with this strategy, Germany is committed to making progress towards sustainable development under the auspices of the United Nations and in the context of the formats such as G7 and G20, as well as in bilateral relationships. On a European level, Germany advocates the strengthening and the implementation of the Agenda 2030, the Paris Agreement, of course, and now also the European Green Deal of the European Commission, together with all our European partners, all the other member countries. And also we try to bring down the topic also to the states and municipalities of our countries, to civil society and to the private sector. So you see Germany and Europe, they're deeply committed to the topic of sustainability and to create alliances. And therefore also Konrad Adenauer Foundation, as an international acting institution, has sustainability as a guiding principle. And we stick with all our activities to this principle, and so do also our regional programs. We have a huge regional program here in Latin America for climate and energy and environment. And we do also have multinational programs in Brussels, Geneva, and New York that deal with this topic. And it's for us as Konrad Adenauer Foundation, it's very important to offer platforms for an international dialogue in order to reinforce the necessity of international cooperation on this topic. And we, as CAS, we hope very much to get Latin America more involved into this process. And Brazil, for us, is one of the most important partners in this respect. So I'm very grateful that CEBRI took the initiative and is organizing with us this series of events. And yes, I would like to thank you, and I wish you all a very fruitful and interesting discussion with all these amazing ladies. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Anja, and thank you, Luciana, for starting this seminar. I want to, first of all, thank our participants and friends, Mariana Matsukatu, Monica de Bolle, and Isabella Teschera, who are going to ensure that we have a wonderful discussion today. What I would like to do is to give a little background of what it is that we are going to discuss first, and then pass the floor to our speakers. Now, I would start by saying that this discussion here is part of a research that we are undertaking in CEBRI, which has been alluded already by Anja, which deals with the reorientation of multilateralism. And our main objective is to address the question, how the deterioration in the multilateral scenario, and by that we mean trust in the scenario, negotiations and institutions, as well as change conditions of globalization, are altering the regulatory and policy scenario of the global economy. And that is particularly important for emerging economies and an emerging economy as Brazil. How should we view the world, and how should we shape our policies in view of this reorientation? We focus on three sectors for which regulation and agreement is paramount: the trade, the digital economy, and sustainability. Our objection is to reflect identified trends and possible bases upon to redirect these multilateral politics. We're not here to solve problems, but we are here to pose intelligent questions and to see what trends are possible. Our reflection is based on a set of premises. The first one is an obvious one, and that the political framework of multilateralism is frail and more than ever necessary. The problems of this frailty and of this derailing, if you wish, are various. They stem from institutional mandates that are weak. We can see plenty of evidence in that in what has happened to the WHO and the WTO. It stems from the fact that the coalition of power, which has shaped this multilateral framework from the post-war until the 90s, is no longer representative of global reality. And the direction of economic development and growth factors upon which it was based is no longer the same. Economic growth has other and different prime movers that were not contemplated in the institutions of multilateralism when they were put together. And finally, I believe equally as important, if not more, the capacity of the system to accommodate change within the existing paradigm is low. And we can see, or capacity and willingness, I would say. And we can see this very clearly when China enters the multilateral system and exposes enormous fraction lines. Now, the flaws of the system are not new. The failures are the result of a long process. It's always useful to recall that projects of reforming the UN are as old as the creation of the UN itself. And that only speaks well of the system. The fact that the system has conflict is not at all a problem. It's actually a sign that it is alive. It is only when the system loses its capacity to regulate conflict that we begin to wonder what it is that is going on and what it is that is wrong in the institutional setup. But we can say that the flaws of these systems are more or less clear. There are shifts in the geography of power. There is an advent of a post-hegemonic world, which is very fragmented. And the consecutive crises of the 21st century, the 2008 financial crisis, the US-China conflict, and of course, lately the COVID-19, which gave a fast forward to all these processes and made very evident the fault lines of the system. At present, if we look around at the discussion, all stakeholders and participants agree on the need for reform. But the options on the table are either sparse, fragmented, or very institutional bounds. I mean, there are reforms about the WTO, and there are many complaints about the system as a whole. But the possibilities or the options for reform that are on the table are very fragmented. In fact, one of the ideas circulating that multilateralism in the future will be a process, a two-tier process, in which we have one core group of selected democracies sharing common regulations, and an outside larger circle sharing mainly the functionalities of the system, is very poor second to what the system once aimed and wished to be. And I believe it is a poor second because it fails to address such basic issues as what could be the basis of a new equation between interests and rules, which is central to anything that is multilateral in nature, and which reflects the current political and economic scenario. Second, how are we to ensure the capacity of the system to accommodate global diversity and institutional mandates which are binding? And finally, what are acceptable instances of conflict resolution? Now, of course, if we look into these three issues and say, well, this is like creating a refounding the United Nations. In fact, these are the basis of multilateral politics, but the fact that this system already exists and needs to enlarge its own premises is a good point from which to believe that reform is possible. Now, when we look at the case of sustainability, in contrast to what we have been analyzing in trade and digital regulation, we can see that multilateral solutions for sustainability, and more precisely for a global alliance around sustainability goals, seems to have a series of very clear advantages, notwithstanding the pessimism that sometimes operates in the fact that negotiations have been at a standstill. So notwithstanding many disappointments and failures in climate negotiations, the cause for sustainability stands out very clear and for very different and very important reasons. The first one, which I would really like to stress, is the fact that it is really the only complete global negotiation in place. It does not exclude anyone. It does not exclude China. There are no hegemonic positions or center or periphery amongst the different players. And positions are not marked by different economic powers. Second, sustainable policies have a track record. They are science and evidence-based policies, as Anja mentioned very well. They have been incorporated as technological, industrial, and financial national objectives, as in the case of Germany. And there is, in fact, a global competition for value added for solutions in the energy transition. Industry and finance are principal stakeholders in this cause. And last but not least, there's political support from civil society and the traditional party system, which has been gaining elections and causes all over the globe. So the sustainability option moves consciousness, which is a bit different from the place of trade and digital innovation. And so it is with these ideas in mind that we had asked the participants today to address three different sorts of issues. The first issue is how we can address the repeated failures and difficulties in international cooperation. Is it possible to move beyond the mandatory procedures and to face new stakeholders' ambitions and accelerate this transformation? And what are the instruments through which this supranational cooperation can be reinforced? Should the UN be a priority? How should it be enlarged? The second set of questions has to do with this global debate concerning the Green New Deal. What factors should we take into account when we are discussing a Green New Deal? In particular, the default conditions of Latin American countries are very different from those of Europe and the United States and Asia. What is particular and what is universal in this cause of a Green New Deal? And how distant, in the case of Brazil and Latin American countries, are we from building or achieving a consensus platform regarding this New Deal? In this, does it make sense to speak of a green economy from the global South perspective? And what would that be? Finally, a third question that has to do with instruments to rebuild. Could a mission-oriented approach, as has been so widely advocated by Mariana Matsukatu, be a solution for building alliances and coalitions for sustainability? Could it be an agenda for our global commons? And how, in the case of Brazil, could it be applied as a solution for sustainable alliances in the Amazon region? So this is the background of what we are thinking, and these are some of the questions that we have asked our participants. Now, our three-part, first of all, I want to reiterate what my colleague Luciana has said. It is really very timely and a great honor to have an all-ladies panel, and especially a panel with ladies with powerful ideas, which are not shying away from engagement and from new solutions. I mean, to think that new solutions are at hand and we have to leave apart old ideas that are not working anymore and to tackle these new problems. So it is really with great pleasure that I would like to welcome Mariana Matsukatu, very well known to Brazil and all of those that are listening to us. We have, I was informed, more than 500 people registered in this seminar. So Isabella, you're going to have a little bit of a tough time mediating questions. Mariana is a professor of economics and innovation and public value at the University College of London. She's also the founder and director of the University College of London Institute for Innovation and Public Policy. She's been advisor to the European Union Program on Science and Technology, many governments, actually the government of Italy, her native country, and the government of Brazil as well. We have then our next speaker, Monica de Boyle. Monica de Boyle is now a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics. She's also a lecturer and former director for Latin American Studies at the School of Advanced Studies of Johns Hopkins University, and she's been a professor of PUC. She is a trendsetter in Brazil, and we follow her in all the medias. And finally, we have Isabella Teschera, Senior Fellow of CEBRI, former minister in two administrations of Minister of the Environment in two administrations. She is the co-president of the International Panel for Natural Resources of the United Nations, UNEP. She's a UNDESA high-level advisor for the Council on Sustainability. And very important to all of us, she had a key role in negotiating the Paris Agreement. So she not only knows of the possibilities, but the flaws and what we are up against in the very near future. So this is the background of where we are. And our basic idea and our mission here at CEBRI is not only to denounce things that are happening, but to have a look at the future. From what basis can we build a different and more enduring solutions for sustainability? That is why we have chosen for this seminar the title, Global Alliances for Sustainability. So without taking the floor too much longer, Mariana Mazzucato, as they say in Italy, ne hai la facoltà.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be amongst such wonderful women, both big thinkers and also very practical. And I just can't wait for us all to be able to travel again so we can do such things live and touch each other too. It's amazing how we're forgetting the touch. So just picking up on what you were saying, I actually just wrote some notes while you were talking. And, you know, it's incredible how some things we say just sound like potentially, you know, commonplace. But actually, if I break down what you were calling for, it's revolutionary, right? So you talked about reorganizing policy tools. So the word policy tools, and really actually even believing in the concept of policy to co-create a different economy instead of just tinkering our way and patching things up. You talked about participating in the global economy. So that need to really, you know, again, that co-creation stakeholder agenda, as opposed to just, you know, regulations and dictations here and there. And you talked about a directed growth strategy. So all this is in order to strive towards sustainable development and a green economy. And of course, digitalization really as a general purpose technology, cutting through that. And I think, again, if you break down what that means, it means we need to rethink what is the policy space. You talked about the mandates as well. What is the remit of policy? Is it just fixing market failures? So you're always kind of too little, too late, putting patches here and there. You talked about the need to reinvent tools, something that I hope that we can talk more about. We've been working a lot around the world, literally redesigning and reinventing, reframing what industrial strategy is about, you know, away from sectors towards real problem focus where all sectors get involved. But that means redesigning things like procurement policy, which some people think is boring, but when I say procurement, I get all excited. And again, that directed growth strategy, which is so important because all the policy language is not about directed growth. If you think about it, it's both about fixing markets here and there, but just think of the word leveling the playing field. How many use that word, leveling the playing field? We're not going to get anything by leveling. We need to tilt the playing field if we want to reach the 2030 agenda. The sustainable development goals will not happen by leveling the playing field. We need to be tilting our economies or societies towards inclusion, towards sustainability. And that's not about nudging, but actually pushing some things through. But again, how? You know, how do we do this together? What is really that way to co-create value, but also what are the tools on the ground? Anyway, so the context of all this is multi-fold. You know, we are all living through one of the most tragic, I think, health pandemics any of us, definitely in my lifetime, have lived through, which have kind of put everything on hold. I've got 4 children, they're all at home. I can't wait for them to get out of the house. But that kind of, you know, striving for normality, you know, going back to normal, as I keep saying in all my recent talks, we need to do everything but going back to normal, because normal is what got us the last types of crises and the future crises that are actually building up. The economic crisis or the financial crisis back in 2007, 2008, which many economies are still suffering through. The climate crisis, you know, just back in January and February, we were worried about the fires and the floods, not, you know, the health pandemic. It wasn't on the radar. I recently looked at the Economist January magazine that looks at the year forward. There was nothing on COVID, January, when already, you know, the crisis was well in place in China. Anyway, so we really need to, as many people I think are calling for, rethink our systems and not go back to normal. But what does that actually mean? What does it mean for the concrete structures that we have on the ground, for the multilateral institutions that Anna, you were talking about, and the failures of both the national and the international institutions to really, over the last years, bring us into a better direction? And just because I'm an economist, I just want to go quickly through some economic issues, which I think are very important to make sure we're on the same page on why normal is not good, because it's not just about, you know, these kind of big flashy things of these crises, which is kind of one on top of the other. There's a great cartoon on Twitter of, you know, the first wave, COVID, the second wave on top of that, the economic crisis, the other wave, the climate crisis, and now the fourth wave is war, the kind of massive tension that's building up globally, especially, but not only, between the US and China. So it's not just those flashy big crises, which of course are massive and affecting everything that Anna talked about, but also that the everyday form of capitalism that we've had and continue to have is very problematic. And, you know, I remember a friend of mine in Brazil told me, you know, Brazil is capitalism without capitalists. I won't name the person because he had lots of power. And I think it's a very, well, I would say the same thing in some ways in Italy, but the kind of lack of real kind of drive of investment. Do we really have investment-led, innovation-led, entrepreneurial growth in many countries? No, we have extreme inertia. And we have inertia in the finance sector, in the corporate sector, in the state sector, of course. And what I mean, and again, I said I'd be brief, I'll do this in 1 minute. Well, that's not true, but I'll try. Finance is incredibly problematic. We have global financial institutions and national ones that are putting something like 80% of those funds back into the financial sector. So, finance, insurance, and real estate are absorbing a huge portion of global finance. We also have lots of short-term finance. There isn't enough of patient, long-term committed finance. And even the pots of finance that people like to cuddle up to and call interesting, like venture capital, it's exit-driven. It's actually massively damaged the ability of some sectors like biotechnology, green technology, space technology, which are science-based, to really get off the ground in many countries, because that requires patience, it requires learning. And the reason we need patient finance is in order to learn and trial and error. And if we're being rushed to exit through a buyout or an IPO, that's very hard. The second thing is we have short-term business. We have, lots of businesses globally just thinking about their quarterly returns. So over $3 trillion have been used in the last 10 years, trillion, 12 zeros, to just buy back shares, boost stock options, executive pay, and other forms of value extraction like that. And again, that needs change. Both of those things I just mentioned have been partly, fueling the increase in inequality in many countries. When you have business that's not reinvesting back into production and human capital and training and research and development, many things suffer, not just innovation, but also workers, because their own skills are not replenished. Skills come as an endogenous function of investment when global investment falls because of what's happening around its financialized structure, big problem. But also the state, as I mentioned, has been a problem. It's really kind of been hollowed out in terms of its capacity. Anja talked about the need for adaptation to accommodate change. Well, that doesn't come just by saying we need to change and accommodate change. You need skills, you need intra-organizational skills within local, regional, national, and international public institutions in order to do that. So to be flexible, adaptable, to have a portfolio approach, to welcome uncertainty, but know how to, move, and adapt to complexity. That requires thinking about how to do that. And yet, if we're outsourcing the knowledge creation institutions within the state, it becomes very hard to do that. And again, climate change, huge. And it's been affected by all four of those things, or three of those things. Financialized finance, short-term business, hollowed out state capacity have made climate change even worse. And 2019, just last year, in the US and Europe, the numbers are terrible. The subsidies to fossil fuel companies in the US were $20 billion a year. And in Europe, $55 billion a year. Last year, this is after all these COPs and COPs here and COPs there. And this year, COPs has been delayed. And I just hope we do everything, and I will finish my time at the end. And don't worry, I'm keeping my time here, so I will not speak over 15 minutes. I will make sure we come back to that, and what all this means for climate change and exactly what we need to do to make sure that COP26 is in our head in terms of how we structure the immediate remedies to the crisis. So anyway, we already had, as I mentioned, different crises when governments came in. They put a lot of money in after the financial crisis. And as I mentioned, a lot of that money just went back to finance. So this time around, with the huge amounts of money that are being poured in by both national and global institutions, we need to learn the lesson. That's not going to work. We can't, at best, be thinking about shovel-ready projects, money coming in to fund infrastructure. As much as many countries, especially in the emerging economies, do need infrastructure, just putting bricks and cement to do a bridge here, a road there, or in the UK, a big kind of new HS2 going from London to Manchester or wherever it's going to go, doesn't get us the kind of transitions we need. So everything we do, from how we build housing to how we build basic infrastructure, but especially about how we think of our green economy beyond just renewable energy, but greening every single sector, transforming production, distribution, and consumption, that's key. And it's not going to happen on its own. And for this reason, I always say, let's, don't think, like, don't reinvent the wheel. You know, start with the Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 of them. There's 169 targets beneath them. And somewhere in the middle, between the big, broad challenge and the really specific kind of projects that lots of those targets are after, are what I call moonshots and missions. And I really think it's critical that every country or city, I'm often increasingly working with cities globally, think about what the kind of local moonshots are. And what I mean by a moonshot is something really ambitious, but practical. You can actually say yes or no, did you achieve it? It can't be climate change. It means carbon neutrality in a specific space. Or in London, it can't be to just help, you know, inner city kids during difficult periods. It means making knife crime, which is a huge problem right now in London, zero. Zero teenagers have to die in London from knife crime. And what that means is really rethinking our strategies to be intersectoral. And I think especially in many developing countries, but also in developed countries, I found it equally, but maybe more in developing countries, the focus on particular sectors, especially in some countries. I was just speaking to the Chileans yesterday around their natural resources. We can't think like that. We need to think of objectives where all the different sectors we have, from nutrition to transport, to the natural resources, to the digital economy, come together to solve concrete problems. And we have to start with the SDGs. And I've been working a lot on this. I brought this tool of missions to the European Commission. It actually passed the parliamentary and the European Council process. And unfortunately, though, it got stuck in the DG RTD, just for innovation. And I've been arguing now with the von der Leyen's cabinet, she's the European Commissioner now, that we need to bring it to the center of the Green Deal, which is in her cabinet, the head, you know, the macro side. We can't relegate these ambitious things to innovation, unless you talk about innovation as structural change, right? As development in the kind of Hirschman and Raúl Prebisch kind of way, then it's okay. But innovation as this little ghettoized process in one ministry, no. We need to bring a mission outcomes-based, public purpose-driven, public value-driven process to the heart of our political economy. And in doing so, we really need to, as I was mentioning, you begin with the challenges, the SDGs, you turn them into very concrete missions. And when I was, well, anyway, sorry, I keep going off on tangents, turn them into concrete missions, intersectoral, but the next step down are projects, all the different projects that might feed that process. And that's where you need policy redesign, Anna. You talked about that. We need to change how we do procurement. Government as purchaser, not just as investor, even purchaser. Change how we do grants and loans. Less as handouts, less as focused on a particular type of company, SMEs, everyone focuses on SMEs, or again, the list of priority sectors. But really redesigning these instruments so they catalyze and nurture as much bottom-up experimentation, trial and error, again, welcoming that uncertain process. But that requires a redesign, so catalyzing experimentation towards public goals, right? And when I was working with the minister Aldo Rabello, when he was the Minister of Defense for Dilma, and then also for Innovation and the Innovation Ministry, we actually looked at the Amazon as such an interesting place where specific missions could be housed, and perhaps we can talk more about that later. But he was especially keen on making the Amazon a place where globally people would come to think about missions around biodiversity, and that the region would also house a CERN-like public lab, global public lab on global diversity, housed within the Amazon, to really bring as many different voices to the table of what even biodiversity means. So it's not just science, but also anthropologists and sociologists. And lastly, I just want to say, because I only have 45 seconds left, that all of this has to be underpinned by state capacity. I already mentioned it in the beginning, but I want to come back to it. If you look at which countries in the emerging economies did best during COVID, it's actually those who have been investing inside state structures. So if you look at what happened in Vietnam, what happened in the state of Kerala, in India, it's fascinating. And I've written a short article about this in Project Syndicate. I don't have time now. But you know, it's absolutely crucial. And super lastly, in my 10 seconds, public-private partnerships. We need to define what we mean by partnership. Too many partnerships are parasitic, they're predator-prey. So what does it mean to really direct these towards the common good? We're actually working with the Vatican, the Pope's team on this, but that really means bringing conditionality. conditionality to the table. And that's what I meant before when I said no more handouts. And this is just as true for global institutions. We need conditionality in the same way that Germany had it when the KfW, the public bank, gave money to steel. The steel industry 2 years ago was conditional on them lowering their material content. Or France recently with COVID, the bailouts only went if, to Renault and Air France, if they agreed to lower their carbon emissions. And in Denmark, no bailouts if you use tax havens. So these conditionalities are really about building symbiotic public-private partnerships. And I think that has to be a cross-cutting theme across everything we talk about. Otherwise, it's a farce, it's a scam. And at best, we'll have more public money going into different areas, but we don't get inclusive growth because we don't really structure within that stakeholder capitalism, a stakeholder structure that really is driven by making sure that all the value creators benefit, and especially the common good conception being designed into the partnerships. So I had more to say, but I've gone over, so I will shut up.
Thank you, Mariana. Monica, please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. And good morning to everybody. Good afternoon to you, Mariana, because it's not good morning to you anymore. And I would like to thank very much CEBRI and CAS for this initiative. I think it's a fantastic opportunity to discuss all of these challenges and the sort of new world that we face going forward out of this pandemic. What is it that we are going to build? This is a really important discussion, and I'm very, very happy to be having it with such a distinguished panel of women, which I never get to be on a panel like this. I think for Mariana, it's probably the same. Being economists, we're always surrounded by men, so this is actually a fantastic opportunity. There were many, many points that Mariana brought up with which I completely agree. I was taking notes while she was speaking. Let me pick up on one, because she was talking about how the idea of leveling the playing field, which is this thing that we keep hearing over and over again, it's become sort of a cliche. I don't even know exactly what that phrase means. But what I do believe in is in what she said. Leveling the playing field doesn't really get us anywhere. It hasn't so far. I mean, we keep talking about it. Presumably we're doing something that does that, but so what? It hasn't really changed anything. So the tilting idea, the tilting the playing field idea is really what I believe in. And I think, that idea touches directly on how we're going to look at sustainability, how we're going to look at social protection, and how we're going to look at health systems going forward, all of these issues being completely interconnected and completely interrelated. So let me speak a little bit about social protection and then put this in a broader context of what is currently happening, and how what's currently happening gives us a view as to the sort of rebuilding and reconstruction that we're going to need to do, and how that gives us an opportunity to basically start from scratch and do away with structures, institutions, modes of operation that really haven't worked well at all and have brought us to this point. How can we move away from that and into something else? On social protection specifically, I think what we have seen in this pandemic is just, the very exaggerated visibility of something that we knew was already going on. So inequality, poverty, inequality in the developing world and in the developed world, poverty in the developing world and in the developed world. These were all issues that were starting to become mainstream in the macroeconomic debate. So I'm speaking as a macroeconomist and sort of looking at this issue from the macroeconomic viewpoint. We've been having many debates about these issues in the last few years. Many of them have led us to, certain conclusions about public policy and the things that should be done, the things that should be recommended, and the things that shouldn't be. But we really hadn't, at least to this point, progressed very far, because as a matter of fact, what we keep seeing is rising inequality and rising poverty in many places. And in many places, the rise in inequality and the rise in poverty is directly linked to climate change. If we think only of the Americas, if we think, for example, only of Central America and the countries in Central America that we know have been very hard hit by climate change, the rise in inequality and in poverty in these places is a straightforward link to climate change. So these issues have been with us for a while. But what the pandemic has done in the context of the humanitarian crisis that it is expose how, how many people are actually affected by these problems, how many people actually live in extremely precarious conditions, how many people are really vulnerable. We had some idea, and of course, in certain countries like Brazil, for example, where there's good micro data, there are good household surveys, there's good sort of, or at least up to this point, there have always been good information to be able to assess the size of these populations. We knew, at least anybody who studied these issues closely, knew exactly what we were talking about. But of course, we're talking about a very select group of people that was following these trends, whereas what the pandemic does is really open this box and leave, show to society at large how big and how really very severe this problem is, even for those people who are not, very close to the numbers to begin with. So in Brazil alone, we know that now we have about 60% or 2/3 of the population that lives in very vulnerable and very precarious conditions. In Latin America as a whole, that number for Brazil is not too far off from the average that you see in Latin America. Of course, it's heterogeneous. So you have countries like Chile where that number is lower, and then you have countries like Ecuador and Bolivia and other places where those numbers are certainly higher. And then you have, countries like Brazil and Mexico, which pretty much reflect the average. Nonetheless, this is a very large proportion of the population. So it's not by chance that the conversation about social protection in these parts of the world, as well as in the developed world, because as I said before, the developed world had also been suffering from a rise in inequality, a rise in poverty, a deterioration in living conditions, a deterioration in social mobility. Given that these are trends that were being observed all over the world and have become much more evident with the pandemic, it's not by chance that discussions about basic income, universal basic income, having minimum income programs, and basic income and minimum income don't necessarily mean the same thing. But it's not by chance that these discussions have now come to light, and it's not by chance that many countries are actually thinking hard about formulating such programs, and some countries have even gone ahead and done it. So Spain is an example of a country that had a discussion about basic income, or actually in their case a minimum income, and they've actually gone ahead and instituted a program to sort of enhance their social safety nets and enhance their social protection. The same is happening in other countries. The same sorts of discussions are happening in other countries. And in Brazil specifically, one thing that I do find very striking is that in spite of all the problems that we've seen with the management of the public health crisis, the management of the economy, and a number of other issues, this particular issue, basic income, social protection, the visibility of this vulnerable population, have really come up and have really become something that has been embraced by society and is also being embraced by Congress as a policy area that needs to be acted upon. And I think this is a very good sign, at least from where I stand at the moment. This is a very good harbinger of things to come when we think about the broader picture of what this pandemic scenario and what comes after it entails. So I was speaking earlier a bit about reconstruction, and we're having this seminar just on the day that the US has published its second quarter GDP numbers. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of the second quarter GDP numbers for the US, but what is very telling about how the situation is evolving in the world's largest economy is that we will need reconstruction once this crisis that we're all living through starts to subside. And that is very well captured by what happened in the second quarter here in the United States. I'm speaking in the United States. So the drop in GDP that we saw in the second quarter, the only comparable statistic to the one that was released today was in 1940. So this is the largest drop in GDP since the era of the Second World War. And a lot of our understanding of this pandemic, at least those of us who have been more alarmed by how serious and how severe this is, and how severely it affects economies, has always been to look at this and to sort of think, the economies are going to need massive reconstructions once this problem passes. And I think, this data that was just released this morning shows exactly how true that statement is. So if we go back, to that era and the post-World War II era, that was precisely when we built the foundations of what we came to understand as the multilateral system. That's when we built the Bretton Woods institutions. That's when we put together a number of agreements that would later form other institutions. That's when we started to put together the GATT, which later became the WTO, and so on and so forth. So at that point, the global economy needed to come together in spite of differences between countries, in spite of still some economic nationalist content in the things that leaders were espousing all over the world. There was a need to come together to rebuild, because otherwise, the global economy simply was not going to be rebuilt. And I think this is exactly the same trend path, or the same sort of situation that we're going to be facing once we move away from the worst, let's say the peak of this crisis, which is what we're going through now. And what that means is that we are going to need to rethink about our modes of cooperation. So cooperation within the global economy, what is that going to look like? What are the current institutions going to need to look like? We know that there's been substantial weakening of the WTO, of, to some extent, the Bretton Woods institutions, certainly of the WHO in more recent times. And that simply is not going to work in a situation where you need to rebuild. So in some sense, the reality is going to be, no matter what kinds of leaders we have in different places, there will be a need for coordination and cooperation at some level. And so we're talking about, in some sense, the pragmatism of reinstating multilateralism, although perhaps in a very different way from what we did after the Second World War. And the pillars upon which this new multilateralism needs to be rebuilt, they're already very clear, because they're the challenges that we had before the pandemic. So they have to do, again, with social protection, which is an issue that we were dealing with before the pandemic. It's climate change, which is very much an issue that we were dealing with before the pandemic. And now, on top of all of this, and linked to this, health and public health, and how public health systems should be designed. So the focus of policy, as I see it, with the role of the state, the role of macroeconomic policies, the role of different stakeholders in the private sector, is going to have to be re-geared and reorganized around these pillars, so that there is a consistent base for rebuilding and reconstructing the global economy, where different countries can participate to the extent that they're able to participate. That touches directly, I think, on the situation of Brazil, because of course we all know that in spite of what's been happening on the environmental front in Brazil, there is a lot that we can still do, and there's a lot to be done on the Amazon. I'm not going to go into depth on this, because I know that this is something that Isabella wants to talk more about. But there is a lot of new thinking that can go into the Amazon, including in the context of social protection and health. Because of course, the Amazon is also a massive resource for anything that we think that is health related. Not only stopping the deforestation, but whatever it is that we can use the Amazon for to develop, potential treatments, potential new ways of looking at different diseases and all the resources that the Amazon contains. So Brazil is very well positioned, at least in the way that the country, not in the way that the country is behaving right now, but it is very well positioned going forward to have a major role in these international discussions around social protection, climate change, and health. So with that in mind, what I see us doing, at least going forward, so that we can move away a little bit from the day-to-day discussion about the economic crisis and how the economic crisis should be resolved and the pandemic and how that should be resolved, I see us being able to move away from that a little bit and discuss and look at these big picture items and these big picture issues and how to drill them down into actual policy and into how you actually design policy in these three fronts that is not inconsistent, that there in a way that there's no inconsistency when we're considering this and when we're thinking about this. Of course, as we do this, we're going to come up with a lot of challenges. So just considering, for example, I've mistakenly put a timer on myself. I have no idea if I'm speaking beyond my time. Anna, would you please let me know?
It's about.
Okay, so because I get carried away very easily on this topic. So to wrap up, I think the main sort of point that I want to leave here on the table is how do we actually take this opportunity, because it is an opportunity. How do we take this opportunity and how do we begin to redesign public policy so that we have a means to put in place the things that we will actually need in this post-pandemic world? And just to echo Mariana once again, we do not want to go back to the world that existed before this crisis. We have an opportunity here to start from scratch. This is how we should be thinking. This is a new starting point. We don't want to go back to what we had before, because that's what has led us here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica. This is really going into a very provocative direction. So I pass the floor to Isabella. We will have questions and answers, but then we will have a chance for each of us to say a final word. Isabella, you guarantee that we make a round before you do your wrap up. Thank you very much. Isabella, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna. Good morning, everybody, my new friends, best friends forever. And I think that you have really huge debate and opportunity to dialogue, innovative pace. I'm very comfortable because I'm not an economist, so I'm a biologist. So I probably will approach this in different perspectives, considering challenges from a developing or emerging economy like Brazil, and also my experience to consider international negotiation, something that I have been working the last 35 years on environmental issues. I'd like only to highlight three or four points concerning international cooperation, as Anna provoked us at the beginning of the section, that we know how to build consensus to negotiate and approve multilateral acts, but we have difficulties or impossibilities to equate the national interest and also to approach the political and economic national dimensions. The both ones mentioned this, but when come back home and we need to manage the decisions, it's really, we have gaps, deep gaps considering international system and national realities, and indeed how we can put the priorities together, national ones, and have co-benefits at the international global level. And this is a big challenge for emerging economies, and climate change is very illustrative. For this, I will highlight 2 points soon. Second, I think that it's very important to improve the stakeholder engagement process considering international environmental issues. We need to understand how to frame these issues and strategies, identifying the agendas, connectivities, and also the instruction axes. Absolutely important tests for civil society engagement. It's not only the will. We need to mobilize civil society. We need to structure, to frame this in such a way that we can allow convergences, we can allow political rooms to dialogue and to also share responsibilities. It's not only based on rights, but also on responsibilities, as Mariana used to highlight It's very, very important. And also, indeed, we have managed the new citizenship concepts or approach. So it's very important how you connect things, not only because of pandemic, but indeed what nature and humankind, mankind and human and nature relationship impose to us. And this is something that we need to learn. We need to learn how to pay attention to the signs and not only live based on fear and on threats, and that we have crisis and crisis and crisis. Come on, we need to shift our way to approach things. And my feeling is that the international cooperation system unfortunately doesn't host all the possibilities and all the political rules that we need to be developed in such a way that we can bring stakeholders closer. And to also the ambition to do more than the government, the state, nation wants to do. This is very interesting because the Paris Agreement is absolutely strategic for this. This is a huge challenge for UN system, but also for us. The multilateral systems also depends on the local actions and outcomes, and also of subnational and business players that sometimes have no domain of the agenda or even for the co-responsibility and the potential co-benefits of this agenda. This is very important. When you have the situation that we have today in Brazil, you go to subnational level, it's like an open gate to try to convince people how we can mobilize or how we can have governance systems, etc., etc. And also for international cooperation. This is very important to highlight. Another point of Paris Agreement, the other side of the coin, okay, the big ambition or the strategic ambition is to cut carbon emissions. But the climate governance system will need to host other players, not only the environmental constituents players, consider the Paris Agreement implementation. We have a tricky political and economic situation here. The game rules and players change, and yet we are discussing with some players that are important, consider the big picture, but not necessarily that they have the responsibility to address cut emission, but also to address strategies that make sense consider development requirements. In Brazil, it's critical, okay? It's a really good example how we can bring these issues together. And in my opinion, I like here to illustrate this considering something that everybody around the world is discussing is Amazonia. What is happening in Amazonia? So Brazil, soon what? No, it's not so what. It's soon what? What's happened? We're still in the last century. We are loser of the new world. We are the winner of the past. We have different ways to approach Brazil today. Consider Brazilian Amazon situation. So what's very important politically to understand, and we have been discussing here this in Brazil with different players, different stakeholders, different groups of people that think that today they are thinking how we can move on, that Amazonia puts Brazil on the road. Amazonia today get us out of the road. This is true. This is the political picture. Okay, you can try to go against this, but this is the political picture. The world sees Amazonia based on two different tracks. The first one, deforestation, okay, and we follow the tendency of increasing deforestation in Brazil. This is a sentence, a quote from an open letter from financial institution, the how to halt deforestation. And on the other side, planetary boundaries, okay? Climate change, biodiversity, natural resource use versus risks, vulnerabilities, regional and global impacts, etc., etc. This is not an official agenda, but this is a scientific agenda with a full engagement, a progressive engagement from global civil society. So we have these two different perspectives or different sides of the coin that indeed means what? That there is what is the implication, the key implication for a society like Brazil? There isn't any possibility of a country resigning its growth possibilities. Amazon is part of the national growth equation in Brazil. And this is the other reaction. This is how people indeed, how government or the players, business leaders, okay, but how we can solve this, how indeed we can manage this. Global Alliance for Amazonia Sustainability, provoking Anna, it's not a formal official debate, but in the international cooperation system, but it is a global civil society debate. It's true. I am engaged in one initiative exactly discussing today planetary boundaries, etc., and consider Amazon deforestation. The private sectors, there are many private sectors. This is very important to highlight here. It's not one pack, and that have different views and projects for Amazonia. Okay, Brazilians, what Brazilian society do you believe about this? Amazon must be preserved and developed, and so what? It's very interesting. It's very interesting when you try to connect things. And you have also, we are fighting against the past today in Brazil and also in Amazon. This is very important to highlight. Brazil, I think that sometimes I have the feeling that the guys want to rewrite the past and not tell new stories based on the future. And this is a contradiction because it's an important political contradiction that UNCIS or international cooperation hosts consider Brazil role and our Brazil engagement in Amazon importance, not only for Brazil, but also for the global or for the planet in such a way that you can live better. The key challenge for Amazon sustainability today, I'd like to highlight here some points that are very interesting. First of all, the Amazon problems are wicked. It's very important to understand this. Not well formulated, ambiguous information, and diversity of parties' interests and conflicting expectations. Absolutely, okay? And Amazon should not consider only a problem, but also as a given reality and as a challenge. This means that you mobilize people in different ways, okay? This means that you can find new ways, for example, as Anja mentioned, to strengthen guidelines for sustainability and for international cooperation, okay? And not a threat for sovereignty, as some ones in Brazil used to argue recently, okay? The solution of one problem, this is the second point, can lead to another. To legalize the private occupation of public lands in the past, this is a political agenda that today is established by Brazilian government, means what? The rise, or could means what? The rise of legal deforestation and the encouragement of further illegal occupation of public lands and widespread of deforestation, which provoke additional carbon emissions and jeopardize the meeting of the targets of the Paris Agreement and undermine the constitutional rights of indigenous people and traditional communities. This is the political framework. And it's very interesting how indeed you can have mission-oriented, as Mariana mentioned, and also how you can have base income and manage better extreme poverty, conservation, et cetera, in a territory that's huge. It's more than half of Brazil. Okay, and it's very interesting how you can go there and try to understand the realities that have there. So the Brazilian position on the Paris Agreement was a win-win proposal. We have the leadership, one of the leaders, I know this because I worked hard, but it was part of the positive development agenda and it needs to be recovered, okay? We need to understand better how we can use Paris Agreement implementation to address this. The financial impacts that deforestation, the violation of the rights of indigenous people may have on investment in Brazil. This is another dimension of the international cooperation, international dialogue concerning Amazonia. And what are the links between these two worlds, economic and reputational ones? How we can indeed manage this, consider the political and the concrete ways to move on in a positive direction. We have different geopolitical and geoeconomic perspectives. We have the classical ones, territorial control and sovereignty, state monopoly, no partnership with civil society, no credibility of science, vision of development linked to the rest of Brazil, no Amazonia political ID, all political as part of the Brazil ID. So, okay, but keep in mind that there is a huge potential. Amazon states control 1/3 of the Senate in the National Congress. What is in the Amazonia for Brazil? What is Brazil for Amazonia? So again, the shaken movers, players that put in checkmate what you want to do, what you need to do if you have this global sustainability, you want to have this global sustainability agenda or alliance, as Anna provoked us, and how you can bring international cooperation close to our development requirements and be part of the game with really actions and solutions. The other side, we have reality. What is the reality today? Amazon coupled and with different use of territory, Amazon occupied and with different use of territory, projects for regional development based on Amazonian perspectives and interests. Germany, it's an important partner on this, for example, German bilateral cooperation, a coalition between national and international non-governmental players as a consequence of the absence of political rooms to debate the future of the region. The notion of political rooms, for instance, is very important. For instance, what it is, we need to find a way to discuss the macro region Amazon, the Pan-Amazonia, okay? And also consider that, unfortunately, the treat that for Amazon cooperation for me it's weak. And also don't need, for example, if CECLAC, other players can indeed join us to facilitate post-COVID crisis, how we can restore, rebuild a new way to be together. If we want to discuss Green Global South, we need to deal with the lowest developed human index rates in the tropical forest domain. And also we need to manage informality in the economy. Okay, it's absolutely, in Peru, it's around 72%. In Brazil, it's around 42, 45% of informalities. So, and this in the Amazon, it's higher. So 4 different types of Amazonia today. The forested one, okay, that need infrastructure, that need strategic demand for investments, public and private ones, that need digital communication, et cetera, et cetera. We have the second one with stocks of forests, primary forest reserve, but with fronts, open fronts for deforestation, like Pará and Amazonas states, okay? You have also Amazon with forest, protect, with poverty, but no misery. This is very important to highlight. And you have the urban Amazonia. 80% of the population, Amazon population, that's around 25 million people, live in cities. Okay, so when you have this international dialogue, it's very interesting that go beyond the forest, understand that the forest hosts urban ecosystems and also urban demands, okay? And I think that this is something very important, how we can bring people together closer and understand the benefits of sustainability alliance in such a way that we can improve quality of life, but not only this, be able to influence in the new lifestyles to understand better the requirements for stability, nutrition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How we can connect things. As Mariana mentioned, I was really amazing hearing you mention Sustainable Development Goals, because I remember it was a flashback to all the debate. I was part of the panel, high-level panel that proposed Sustainable Development Goals. And I went back to past exactly to remember the debates arguing the importance of to have Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030. So it's there, it's true. We are able to think, but not necessarily to bring this into the political reality and economic reality, okay? So Amazon, what's have today to go to the end? Amazon, no planning for the territory occupation, urban frontiers put pressure on the forest, and the cultural behavior of the local population defines patterns of urban land use. No vision, no plan, no logic, and de facto laissez-faire, okay? It's very important to highlight here how infrastructure is key, but it cannot be neglected. Digital communication is key challenges to connect Amazonia and to bring people together. So we have trade-offs. We have the old economies or the commodities, or everything that is reality there that we need to improve with supply chains, blah, blah, blah. And the other side, we have the new economies, the environmental services, the green economies, the new market, carbon markets, biotechnology, et cetera, et cetera. How we pack this? How indeed we manage better business as usual, okay, and promote not only the transition, but the transformative ambition that we discussed when we bring sustainability into the room. So science is a key player for Amazon development agenda. Consider transparency, consider impacts and the frontier of the knowledge. Okay, but also for the sustainability approach in Amazon. Science is an influencer of society actions, frame the big picture. This is an innovative political role. This is not only to share knowledge. The scientists in Brazil used to play strategically as a political player. And it's very interesting how we can bring this into the room and repack and show that we have solutions. Finally, Amazonia, but you cannot forget that we have different science. Science are many, okay? There are many fronts here, not only bioindustry and biotechnology, okay? Very important to highlight this. Second, finally, Amazonia, future-oriented. But as you cannot guess the future, should we create one? And this is a really important motivation, because you have several Amazons. We need a broader view and a micro-regional views. Otherwise, we will reinforce fragmented angles. So in my opinion, to finalize, I think that tackling illegal deforestation faces the risk of becoming a self-defeating agenda. We need to avoid this trap, okay? In the other side, you need, for example, to provoke or to bring concrete actions to mobilize people in this innovative direction. For example, sanitation, we have a new regulatory arrangement in Brazil concerning investments in sanitation. What is key to as an entry point? What is the strategy for sanitation in Amazonian cities, for example? How indeed do we want to go there and to manage this with international funds allocation, et cetera, but indeed how we can build consensus and solutions. And of course, Amazonia has the worst indication in sanitation in Brazil, together with poverty, et cetera. So Brazil, it's very important here that sustainability demands for democracy. In Brazil, democracy is a huge misunderstanding, as Jaguaribe used to remember us, okay? But Brazil is bigger and better than the current government, okay? Governance without government is challenging. It's what we are facing today. And Amazonia Coalition needs to constrain the government to do what we need to do. And my feeling is that we need to be absolutely optimistic, but absolutely pragmatic. That's why women are so interested to be invited to join to rebuild the world, but to rebuild what we have today in Amazonia. Be welcome, be on board. And my feeling is that to have really any opportunities to go and to understand and to address better the importance of an original course of action with national gains and global co-benefits, and as Anna used to discuss with me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Isabella. Before passing on to you to pick up the questions and answers, which I believe we have a lot, I just want to pick up on a set of phrases that and a set of concepts that the three of you launched today, which I think is really very interesting. The first one is, Isabella, you talked about rewriting of the past. This is something that we have been doing in Brazil lately with a great deal of energy, not only rewriting, but reinventing. And the second thing which Mariana has said is the idea of inertia and the idea of that there is no new normal. So in fact, what we have in front of us is really a daunting task. As you said, Isabella, we know how to build consensus, but the question here is not how to build consensus of how we are going to go back to a new normal, but how to build consensus on how we look at what the problems are. This is our task. Our task is having some common idea of what the problems are. And in here, I think it's really very relevant, two things that Mariana has said. We should not reinvent the wheel, but we need definitely a new mindset. It's not a question of state versus market, which is a common trap that we in Brazil love to fall into. But it's a question of reinventing the capacities of the state to deal with this new solution. Of course, some of us have to deal also with the pillage of the state, but it's not sufficient to reinstate the state. We have to reinvent its capacities. So in fact, we are at the stake here. The question of sustainability is a question of repositioning our mindsets and reallocating importance to the problems that became so evident in the accumulation of crises that we have faced. So I started with a hopeful note, and I think that we end with a daunting task, but I believe that we have many questions and answers. So these are just a bit of a summing up of the interesting things that have been said in this discussion. So the floor is yours, Isabella, to coordinate this question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, again. I have different questions here, but I don't know how much time you have. You need to manage time. So I will present one question that I think that for the both ones, how could be the big mission in the current scenario, okay? How can we translate the need to tackle climate change, which sometimes seems to abstract into the concrete intersectoral missions? And Monica, you have one specific for you, understanding that we must raise a new normal. wouldn't it be case to create a new metrics different from GDP? And for Mariana, I think that to have another one for you, if you allow me. What would be the governance structure of the Amazon Global Innovation Lab that you propose? How could the multilateral community act in this new policy space without triggering the sovereignty concerns of the Brazilian state? So I pick up here 3 different questions in such a way that you can repack and answer and connect and have your connections and allow us to know about your thoughts and also to answer the questions. Thank you very much.
Should I begin? I unfortunately have to leave. I'm so sorry. I unfortunately have to leave at 4:25 for another appointment at 4:30, or my 4:30. Who knows what time it is everywhere else. So really important questions. One, just let me pick up on the governance one, the second one, because I don't think we spoke enough about that. The governance challenges currently, which science is facing, and it's not just science, if we think of health, but I was going to say with the COVID pandemic, this kind of race for the vaccine, I just want to use that as an example, is huge. It's really being abused again and again, as we know in this particular sector, health. As I was saying, the public-private partnership is not being well governed. The World Health Organization has asked for the patents, the intellectual property rights around the vaccine to be pooled. They've called for a common pool of the patents in order for there to be, and they use a very important word, collective intelligence, right? If we structure and govern innovation in a particular way, you can get massive rent seeking and sort of, value extraction, or you can really foster collective intelligence. And as we know, intellectual property rights have been abused again and again. They are too wide. They're used for strategic reasons, too deep. So it's very hard to license, for example, drugs, but especially too upstream. We are actually patenting today the tools for research. That is not what patents were meant to do. So just like Anna said, it's not about the dichotomy state versus market or business. It's also not dichotomy, should we have patents or not? It's how you govern that process. So I really think what would be amazing is if a new serious kind of public lab in the Amazon was governed with those principles of collective intelligence in mind. And then that was used to actually foster new thinking between many other types of global organizations, but also governance structures for innovation, where science is just one of the inputs, but really what we're talking about is also political economy and society in terms of the impacts of how we misgovern or govern well those processes. In terms of the missions, I mean, the last thing you want is an economist coming into a country telling them what the missions are. Really, what the concept of missions is, it's a new framing for how we currently do things. So again, instead of having industrial strategy with a list of sectors that we want to help, you really think about what the problems are. So, in Brazil, you know what your problems are, but they will be different very locally in a city, in a region like the Amazon, or at the national level. But you can have different missions at each one of those levels. But again, what that actually means for who's at the table ex ante, not just ex post, thinking about it. Globally, you might know there's a very important movement called the just transition, so that trade unions, especially Sharon Burrows, who is one of the leaders of the International Trade Union Organization, she's kind of coined that term. And it's a very important term. It basically means as industries and sectors transit towards a green transition, which means some sectors disappear, others, really change, and you need new skills. We need to sort of protect workers instead of just letting them to be displaced. It's very important, but it's too reactive. We really want, for example, labor's voices and the voices of students from Fridays for the Future, the voices of nurses, if we're talking about, the health and the caring economy, to be at the table, to even define the mission itself, right? I think this is what we're really bad at. I've worked on missions everywhere. It's much easier to sort of come up with missions or to think of procurement policy or to rethink industrial strategy. It's so hard because we haven't been taught how to do that, to really genuinely, in a non-tokenistic way, bring a diversity of views at the table and to have a safe space to disagree. I've been working with an artist, Oliver Eliason, who you might know is a famous Danish artist who recently had a retrospective of his work at the Tate Modern in London. He says public space is a space where you should feel safe to disagree, Now think of all the terrible disagreements on the talk shows, the Fox News talk shows or the Brazilian talk shows you have. That's not real debate. A real debate is where you can really foster, again, collective intelligence, but often that's conflict. You know, we got some of the most important things in capitalism through conflict. The weekend, that was fought for. People died to get us the weekend. The 8-hour workday, people died. You know, feminists got us birth control pills. They fought for that. They fought for the vote. The AIDS, HIV community fought to get the HIV drug, you know, basically, you know, that trajectory. Both technological and social innovations have required conflict. How do we create a safe space to have conflict? And how do we get civil servants to be trained to listen and have empathy, to really have a dialogue instead of just patting, you know, Greta Thunberg on the head? You know, what does it mean to listen to people who are demanding change and fast change? I think that's a really important question for any country who goes seriously towards a mission-oriented approach. Isabella, you're
sorry. Yes, sorry. Thank you very much. I think that probably we need a week with us together discussing, and will be really probably will be helpful. But it's amazing how your comments, and of course that I'd like to discuss better, but you don't have much time. Monica, please, you have the floor. And after this, I don't know if Anja or Jaguaribe would like to add some final comments. That I will wrap up this and say bye-bye and see you soon. I hope so.
Thank you. So let me try to address the concrete aspect of things. There are many concrete things that I think have already been in the works, and that we just need to sort of elaborate them better and think better through the costs and benefits of doing certain things. So as an example of something that, you know, as I was mentioning in my earlier comments, something that has really transcended the political economy barrier, so to speak, or at least seems to have transcended that barrier, is the issue of basic income. So if we use the issue of basic income as a sort of a starting point, or a point from which we can learn a lot of lessons of how to deal with all of the political economy obstacles and the conflict that appears in the public space that Mariana was referring to, I think it's a really interesting experience, because the very fact that, you know, the exposure of vulnerability that the pandemic has made visible has served to bring a lot of people together and consider a policy that only a few months ago was completely unthinkable. For most people, basic income was pie in the sky. It was a pie in the sky kind of discussion. And now it's very much a pragmatic one. And with governments trying to think through how to do this in the context of their fiscal constraints. So if we can get a lot of the other discussions into that sort of realm, and there are things that are very unique to basic income, which perhaps we might not be able to do for other policies, but there are things about basic income, or the idea of it, which I think can be used to garner support for other agendas. And I think we can learn a lot from that process and see how we can adapt it, specifically in the context of Brazil, where this issue has gained massive ground. So when I think of other concrete policy areas, I'm thinking here of, and Izabella mentioned it, I'm thinking here of infrastructure. You know, Brazil has massive infrastructure needs. We have a new sort of regulatory marker for sanitation that has just been approved, as Isabella was mentioning. We have a massive sanitation gap in Brazil, massive. And when we think about sanitation alone, it touches on inequality, and it touches on health issues, obviously. And infrastructure as a whole touches on this rebuilding of national economies that we're going to need to do. So it's very natural to think that one very concrete thing that we should be considering, one very concrete policy that we should be thinking about, is how do we get adequate, in the sense that Mariana was speaking, public-private partnerships in the sanitation sort of area to push through those infrastructure investments, which will help to build the economy, because of course, sanitation is a sector that cascades into a lot of different sectors of the economy because of its linkages with the construction sector and the linkages of the construction sector with the cement sector and the energy sector and so on and so forth. So, you actually have a multiplier effect on the economy when you start thinking about that sort of infrastructure policy. So this is an area that's very much up for grabs for us to consider and to design, what to do. So as a concrete example. As another concrete example, health systems. Health systems around the world are going to be discussed. Here in the US, there's already a discussion going on about what to do, because obviously the private-only health system in a pandemic has shown all of its weaknesses. So that discussion is going to be ever present here in the US. It was already present before the pandemic. In other places, countries that do have public health systems are thinking about how to make them better. In Brazil, we have a lot of opportunities to not only boost the SUS, which is our public health system, but also think about how to make it better, how to make it even better than what it is. So here we already have a pretty big policy agenda, if we consider just those three aspects alone, that turn, some of these big sort of high level ideas into actual concrete policies that we can think about. Moving to the issue of metrics and how you actually measure things and measure the welfare of the economy and measure, the way how the economy is doing. GDP is not a perfect metric, and I think we can all agree on that. It's not. It's just a way of sort of adding up everything that a country produces, coming up with a metric of how much is produced internally, which in turn, by sort of accounting identities, should add up to how much income a country makes in a year. That is what GDP is in its essence. It's just it's an adding up sort of exercise. It doesn't take into account inequality. It doesn't take into account metrics of inclusion. It doesn't take into account metrics of development. Nothing of that sort. Nonetheless, it is the longest sort of on a time series scale. It is the longest time running metric that we have, and because of that, it retains its importance. Because if we want to compare, how a country is doing compared to how it was doing in the past, if we come up with a new metric today, we have no way of making these comparisons. So GDP, with all its faults and with all of its shortcomings, we need to keep it. What we need to do is perhaps complement it, and I think we are already in the process of doing that, with other metrics which tell us things that GDP doesn't tell us. So we need to complement GDP with metrics of social mobility, inequality, access to basic services, put all of these things together and really have a panel of indicators that actually tell us how a country's doing. But it's not doing away with GDP, because GDP is important for comparison purposes. Thank you.
Monica, thank you very much. Unfortunately, I don't have time. I'm so sad. And Anna, I don't know if you and Anja would like to add some final comments, less than 30 seconds, because I know that Mariana has to leave, and we have other important questions here, like education strategies.
But you guys can stay.
Okay.
It's a pity that we do not have a lot of time left, because I would like to continue, but I hope maybe that we can keep in touch and continue our interesting talks. So it's also difficult to summarize everything now in a minute, and I know that everybody has to leave now. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, CEBRI, for the initiative, and I'd love to listen to you and to your ideas. And I also see that we have chances with the pandemic to put some topics back on the agenda. And this is also, like you mentioned, with the pragmatism, we can reorganize multilateralism again, and Brazil is needed in all in the whole story and the whole discussion. So this would be my part at the only 1 minute left. So thank you very much for our cooperation. I always love love to be here with CEBRI and our partners, and thank you for your participation.
Anna?
Thank you very much. I just want to thank you all for this very inspiring conversation, and just to say that this is it's the beginning of a big project, and everything that we said here, we're going to continue. We're going to pick your brains again, and we have what we call structured conversations, because it's going to take a little bit more work to arrive at least setting up where we think consensus over the problems are. So this is just a relative goodbye, and thank you very much to all.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I'm sorry because I cannot share all the questions.
Un abraço.
Abraço para todos, and I hope that next time we can drink and share caipirinha to celebrate our innovative ways to rebuild the world. Okay, I'm confident.
For sure.
I'm confident with our pragmatism.
Thank you so much.
Will make the difference. Thank you very much, my friends. Also for the others, everybody join us, CEBRI support and CAS, and let's do this together. Okay, I hope so. And really, the amazing debate, and I hope that you can move on, and please reoriented Brazil, consider our future, but based on our present. This is very important. Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.